today, I'm going to take this very broad view on validity, but also dig very deeply. So what I'm looking at here, there'll be these notes, and a recording will be posted on my website here um, within hours. By the end of the day today, all of this will be available, so don't worry too much. Today, I want to give a brief introduction to this webinar itself. I want to focus on the concepts and histories of validity. Then I want to, in the third section, bring bridging concepts and practices. There's actually two subparts to that. One is I want to introduce to you my perspective on construct theories. There are many perspectives on construct theories, so I'm going to focus on my particular view on construct theories. Then I want to bring forward a particular theoretical orientation I have been developing and a methodology I've been developing around explanation-centered validity and validation practices. And the highlight in this approach is explanation, but also I'm going to highlight for you today on the many ways of being human and how the many ways of being human manifests itself in the area of psychometrics measurement and assessment. For far too long, we've gone into a moral paralysis and almost a complete rejection of this notion of the many ways of being human in the field of assessment, testing, and measurement in psychometrics. That's a bold statement. It's not entirely true, but it's not false either. It's been a great deal of pushback against it. What I want to focus on is explanation-centered validity and validation practices, and really bringing forward this many ways of being human. And some concluding remarks at the end. You'll also find at the very end of this these slides references, a long list of references, and you'll see some references on the pages themselves. All right, let's begin our journey then. Let's take section number 1, the introduction. I want to it's interesting, this first section, I want to begin with some general remarks. I want to put us all on a common language and understanding about measures, tests, and assessments. So there's going to be some general remarks. I want to give an example of a measure. It's one that I've used in my teaching. It's one I've used elsewhere. I like it actually as an example. It's also something that helps us ground our ideas. Then I want to talk about items as building blocks and transition to the second section. So some general remarks. Well, first is that the concept, method, and process of validation are central to social, psychological health, science research. For without validation, any inferences made from measure may be meaningless. A couple points to keep in mind from this first bullet is that I'm taking a very wide lens on this. So I'm going to talk about social science, psychological, mental health, research writ large. This includes educational assessment and testing. It includes population health surveys, econometric surveys. It includes well-being, quality of life, and other psychological domains, attributes, etc. So that's the first part of this. The second part of this is the statement that without validation, any inferences made from our measures may be meaningless. And I say maybe because we could just, logically just stumble upon a meaningful inference. But what we don't know is whether that is the case or not. So we don't have the empirical evidence that is deeply needed to be able to support these claims. Throughout this presentation, again, I'm going to use test, measure, instrument, questionnaire, survey, scale. There's so many names for what are really a codification or summarization of observed phenomena in the broadest sense. So I'm going to use these terms interchangeably throughout. Some things will be knowledge tests, other things will be instruments, questionnaires, surveys, but they all are going to have some common features we're going to talk about in a moment. Furthermore, lest we fall into traditional camps and our comfortable little silos. I grew up in the prairies of Canada. Silos actually are valuable there, but they're not always as valuable in our setting here. So I don't want to fall into traditional camps. And I'm going to make the bold claim that validity applies equally to tests, measures, questionnaires, surveys used to name but a few of the common applications. So an area of interest I've had for many years is language assessment, educational measurement, be it large scale population level educational testing or certification, licensure, social indicators research, quality of life, well-being is an area that I'm particularly interested in and has been an important area in Europe, but also in Italy in particular. At one time, it was a very prominent movement in Italy around this matter of well-being and quality of life, including at the National Institute. But it's also used in educational measurement. Let me give you an example of this. In post-secondary education throughout parts of Europe and other parts of the world, there's a great deal of interest in student feedback, student measures of quality of learning, quality of experience, teaching evaluations, all of these kind of satisfaction with learning. These are all fall within this area. There's a lot of interest where this applies also is in health measurement, measures of health status, PROMs or patient-reported outcome measures, or I'm learning about PREMs, patient-reported experience measures. These are all follows examples of what I'm talking about today, where we can deal with this. Let me give you an example that I've used in several of my papers. And I've gathered a lot of different data using this measure over the years. But let me give you a nice example to give us a feel for what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to talk about a psychological measure. It's a test or measure, depending on the language you want to call it. It's being viewed as a set of self-report questions, items, whose responses are then scored and aggregated in some way to obtain a composite measure. So some key things here is that self-report. That's what I want to use as an example today. People are responding to a questionnaire. They feel compelled to respond to a series of questions. It's amazing what people will divulge and will say if you put a question, particularly in our cultural traditions of notions of questionnaires and surveys. They appear now. They appear on things like phones. They appear on your watches. They appear on tablets. I mean, and they also appear in surveys and questionnaires. So people are compelled to respond, self-report to a series of items. Then these items are then aggregated, combined, and some sort of overall score is calculated. What I want to highlight here as well is that today I'm not going to discuss this very interesting area of single item measures. In fact, I have a small army here at the University of Graduate Research Assistants working with me, and that we are about halfway into a very large scale study right now looking at what kind of evidence do researchers present and how do they discuss, if you wish, validity of psychological single item measures. The most famous one, probably all over the world translated, is the single item measure, how happy are you? And it's scored on like a 1 to 10 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 point scale. But there's also pain measures like this. In fact, there's a remarkable number of measures like this. I'm not going to talk about those today. And who knows, maybe by the end of this visit as a visiting scholar there in Milan, who knows, towards the end I may even have some early results I can share with you all from that study. But we'll eventually be sharing it one way or the other, definitely with you all. But today I want to talk about multiple items, People self-report, and then we calculate, we create some sort of aggregate or overall score. In many psychological measures, for example, attitude measures, there is, or even personality measures, social psychological measures, health measures, there's no correct or incorrect responses per se. Rather, we are dealing with these compelled self-report responses. There is no correct or incorrect, but there is a scoring, and we're going to see that in a moment. Here's the example I want to use. It's the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale, the CSD. I use it because it's widely used, translated into so many countless languages. A lot of psychometric studies. There's actually a revised version. This is the original one. And it's a measure of depressive symptomatology. It's sort of an index of the current feelings of general depression. And so individuals are asked to, for each statement, circle the number to indicate how often you felt or behaved this way during the week. So the first item is, I was bothered by things that usually don't bother me. And, 0 is not even 1 day, 1 is 1 to 2 days, a 2 with 3 to 4 days, and a 3 would be 5 to 7 days. Items 4, if you were to add these up, the larger the overall score, right, the higher the score on the measure, the greater the level of depressive symptomatology, right? The greater the level of feelings of general depression. Of course, you would have to do something with items 4, right? I feel that I was just as good as the other people. You'll notice that the valence of that item is unlike the others. So it's actually if you could think of that as sort of a well-being measure as opposed to as a measure of, or positive well-being measure, rather than an index of an item tapping general feelings of depression. There's 4, 8. I felt hopeful about the future. 12, I am happy. Well, there you go. That's an obvious. There has to be some recoding. 16 is the other one. I enjoyed life. But once you recode those, you add up the responses, the scores they read, and then you get an overall score. This is a very typical kind of measure that we're talking about. There are items or tasks or questions. There's a performance, a selection of an option, and then there's an aggregate score that's computed. The one that we're going to talk about today a little bit later is item 17. I had crying spells, meaning I've had cases where one was crying in the last week. Now, my family, I come from the deep south of Italy, sono Italiano, ma sono calabrese, which means I come from my family in particular, and I've spent time in Calabria, and of course we're fairly emotional people, and and I'll cry over a beautiful bowl of pasta with a nice bolognese sauce. My apologies to my friends in Milan. I do like my bolognese sauce, but I also like the Milanese pasta as well, and sauces. So no offense to my friends in Milan. Hope someone smiled with that. But this notion of a crying spell and crying in the last week's very interesting. Not even in 1 day did you cry, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 7. We're going to come back to that one because that's an interesting one that we'll be talking about. This is a fairly typical kind of measure. That's why I like to use it as a sort of example. It has a lot of the features that we're talking about. There's the citation for it, the original, the Radloff in 77. The essential features, therefore, are a series of questions to which individuals respond and a composite score that arises from scoring them. In short, we're usually talking about a set of questions whose responses are aggregated into a composite or overall score. But here's the key point. The composite score is not depression itself. All of a sudden, I'm beginning to introduce this notion of an underlying or unobserved, perhaps as begin to point towards construct theory. So that the composite score is not depression itself, but rather an observable indicator of depression, or more accurately, the concept, the composite score, the overall score on this measure, is an indicator of depression symptoms, an aggregate indicator of the depression symptoms. Keep this in mind because this is something that is a slippery language that we fall into far too often in the field. We, in my language, confuse the overall score with the attribute that we're interested in, the psychological attribute. I may even begin to insert the idea construct. Let's call it as a psychological attribute. All right. So items then are the building blocks. Tests and measures come in various forms and lengths, measure many psychological phenomena, such as knowledge of some domain in educational testing or psychological attributes and characteristics of test takers. Despite their various forms and lengths, all assessments and tests and measures share the property of being composed of a series of items, tasks, or questions to which an individual responses. Simply stated, the items are the building block of an assessment. We talk about item analysis can be used in the development process to aid in item revision and also later to help understand why a test shows specific levels of reliability and validity. And I want to highlight this last point because this why is something I'm be starting pointing to in what I'm calling an emergence of a science of measurement, is to ask explanations for variations in item performance or in overall test score performance or scale score performance in this sense. That why question in my argument, once we've been, and this is something a drum I've been beating for many years, is to really push for this explanation focused view, bringing explanation into the science of psychometrics and measurement assessment. Primary goal today is to describe the theories and methods of validation. However, we believe, or I believe, that one needs to articulate what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. So we're going to delve into the foundations. We're going to remind ourselves of the distinction between methodology and method, and validity and validation. And far too often we have equated or conflated validity and validation. So the validity is a technique. Validity is a correlation coefficient. Validity is a factor analysis. The case I'm going to make is that is how we validate. Those are the methods we use for validation. Validity is a concept is relevant, and that's what we're going to get into today as we transition into the second section. But I don't want to miss this middle point, which is that one needs to have an understanding and needs to be able to articulate what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. And I've said this in published articles by Ben Shear and I, and in the my edited book in, I think it was 2000 and gosh, I think that may have been it was in the book by edited volume by myself and Eric Chan, where we did sort of a study of the genre of the reporting of validation studies. And in that context, in that chapter in particular, we highlighted, and you'll see a citation to it later, that if you don't have an articulated view of validation, how do you know that an articulated view of validity, how do you know that your validation target, right? First of all, how do you choose your validation methods? You don't have an explicit statement about what is validity. And furthermore, how do you know whether you still have achieved it or not? So and I don't really care which view of the many that I'm going to talk about, and even the ones that I don't bring in, pick one of them. At this point, I don't really much care which one you choose, but I do think we need to be able to state something so that you can begin to have a target and something that begins to inform your validation. So I want to consider validity and validation for all kinds of measures. And this is really, if you want to think about it, as sort of I want to begin to focus on a meta theory of validity rather than validity for language assessment, cognitive assessments. And we all like to do this. Oh, no, my worldview, my measurement and assessment is totally different because I do work on behavioral measures of kids in schoolyards. Mine's totally different because I do population measures and panel studies, or mine's different because I'm interested in school psychology. Listen, I understand that there are unique features to all of these many applications, but we cannot move forward if we do not admit that there's also a great deal of commonality. If not, we're just going to end up in this very, in my opinion, unproductive place where we can only speak with and speak to individuals who are like us in our particular thing. Now, that's part of the gambit here. That's part of the, if you wish, what is going on is people will try and, in my opinion, super constrain their domain, and therefore, in some senses, you can almost begin to play games like, I'm a big fish in a small pond. Sorry, folks, I'm calling you out. There is a lot more in common than there is unique. We need to focus on the common today, accepting that there are unique aspects to language testing versus general cognitive measures versus population health measures versus proms versus great, but there is also an immense communality. And if you wish to debate me on it, I think you first need to begin with the fact of looking at your literature and seeing how many general papers by people like Lee Crombach, Bob Lynn, and many others in the field, Sam Messick, Michael Kane, Denny Boersboom, all of these prominent scholars that are articulating views of validity are in all of these domains. So come on, let's accept that there is a communality and that there's value in focusing on that communality. Not at, I appreciate if you're doing psychological assessment in an intake clinic in the center of Rome or in the center of Montreal, I appreciate, or anywhere in the world, in Copenhagen, in Johannesburg, wherever we want to be doing this, I get it that there are unique features to what is a psychological assessment at a walk-in clinic, but you can't tell me that it shares nothing in common with all these other domains. All right, I think I've preached more than enough on that idea. So our aim is to think broadly, to embrace and show the relation between the many prominent views. Right, and what follows, we reflect on the state of the praxis and theorizing, where it's been, where it is now, and where I think it is and should be going. That's the notion of the horizon. Going to try and synthesize and generalize some of these comments and shine a light in certain areas. All right, time for a little bit of cafe. And let's move to section 2. Here I'm going to talk about the concepts and histories of validity. So I'm going to do sort of the 3 parts to it. I'm going to highlight sort of this over-the-shoulder look back. And I want to focus on what I'm going to describe as 4 periods of the historical focus and at least 8 conceptualizations of validity. And what I'm describing has variations. I'm work that I've published on this in a couple of different places, but or not the same thing, but I've talked about these themes and ideas in a chapter of mine in 2007. I did in the Handbook of Statistics, to a paper by Ben Shear and I that I mentioned earlier in the edited volume by Zumbo and Chan. I've also discussed it even recently in a book chapter on survey design with my dear friend Jose Luis Padilla from Spain, who I might add as a little side plug. The International Test Commission is holding their conference in Spain, and I think it's next year. My bag's already packed. I can't wait to go there. So I urge you all to take a look and reach out. Professor Padilla is one of the co-organizers of that conference. There's a recent paper in a chapter in an edited volume in the area of survey design as well. So all these conceptualizations I'm talking about. Brief historical overview with an eye towards description of the recent work on the theory of validity and process of validation. This section portrays the concepts of validity undergoing consolidation, debate, and reconciliation and reconceptualization. I want to raise a few questions and reawaken long-standing debates that lie at the heart of this empirical science and speak to our collective desire to formalize and better articulate the concepts and measures that we employ. As reminded in the philosophies of science, linking concepts to observations in the history of validity, relying on nomological network is a very big one, is a fundamental strategy to clarify the meaning of a measure. So this idea, and you'll see that there is a marriage of ideas, and not just in the history of science, but philosophies of science, statistics, mathematics, psychology, behavioral science, behaviorism, cognitive psychology. All of this is going to be reflected in here. But as we're reminded in the philosophies of science, linking concepts to observations is a fundamental strategy to clarify the meaning of a measure. I always love to begin a quotation. I feel particularly happy when I begin to quote some of my interest in the history of science, philosophy of science. Aristotle in his Metaphysics pointed out that we understand those things best that we see grow from their very beginnings. And this quotation I've seen many times. My friend Howard Weiner was one that's reminded me of it on several occasions. So with this in mind, we really do understand the things best that we see grow from their very beginnings. Thus begin our discussion of measurement with an over-the-shoulder look back, the history of the idea and the procedures that were developed to aid in the process. The general aim is to trace the history of the concept from their heuristic beginnings to more statistically rigorous methods currently available using things like item response theory, Roche models, structure equation models, multi-trait, multi-myth. Those are things that are really more rigorous statistical ideas, but I want to trace it right from the heuristic beginnings to the overly statistified, there's my new word of the day, the over-reliance on very elaborated statistical models for validity. And this actually there's a citation here of the paper, of the chapter by Jose Luis Padilla and I in Advances in Questionnaire Design. And some of this comes from there and from a chapter with Ben Shear. Please don't be alarmed because I'm going to talk about 4 somewhat distinct periods of validity, praxis, and theorizing. And I do not want to be interpreted as suggesting nice, natural, linear, stepwise progression. That's not what we're doing, nor am I suggesting there's an evolution to the best theories. Some may argue, and there's some compelling argument, that some of the ideas that were on in the 1960s may be our quote-unquote evolution has gone off track. So there is, I think, something to be kept in mind here that these periods are not disjoint. Some of the earliest ideas still continue to this day, and nor am I believing that we are evolving to a perfect approach to thinking about validity. I just want to describe these various periods and how they're coming together. I use praxis here to convey a distinction between practice and theory. I'm really trying to highlight the application or use of the knowledge and also reflect some of what is, in essence, the convention, habit, or custom of validity work of these periods of time. And again, this is the chapter I won up by Ben Shear and I in 2014 in the book by Eric Chan. That's what I've been mentioning. You also see some of that in there. So the early to mid 1900s, in the history of psychology and in education and in health, was dominated by a criterion-based model of validity, with some focus on content-based models. So the early to mid 1900s was really dominated by the criterion-based model. Please do not be surprised. The heyday of different forms of behaviorism are matched with that time period. And the criterion is what we're trying to predict with our measure. So we're trying to predict a behavior so that a measure of personality like the MMPI may have been created by either criterion or Kane approaches, or something like a depression measure or a personality measure. There is a criterion, or an educational test or a health status. There is a criterion, some behavioral criterion at that point that you're trying to predict with your test and measure. And in many ways, in this early time period, in this criterion-based model, one really has the test or measure being a shorthand, some efficient, cheap, fast way of being able to predict a behavior that's either going on at the same time, concurrent, or going to happen in the future. So a classic example is admission exams into programs. Margarita and I and Samira Tagliabue were talking, and a group of scholars there in Milan were talking even a week ago about measures that are used, really, that there is some criterion in the future that is being, where this measure is a predictive device. That this view of validity had its biggest time period where it began to emerge was the early to mid 1900s. Not too surprising, corresponding with this behavioral orientation. From the mid 1930s to the late 1960s, we saw the introduction of and move toward what emerged to be called a construct model, with its emphasis on construct validity. The seminal piece being Crombeck and Miel, 1955. And so the 1930s to the late 1960s. So if you think of the history of psychology, there is a dominant phase in which behaviorism is the dominant tradition. Then we begin to question what goes on between stimulus and response, meaning the stimulus being an item and a response being the compelled response from the questionnaire. And we began to talk about information processing theory, cognitive psychology, and we're now beginning to say what's going on between stimulus and response, and we're beginning to move and accept again this notion of unobserved phenomena, unobserved attributes, and a construct validity. This idea of stimulus response views is really highlighted in a paper that will be appearing later this year in the European Journal of Psychological Assessment, with myself, my colleague Brian Maddox, and Naomi Kerr, in which we talk about construct theory, but an expansive view where we talk about not just test constructs, but process constructs. But the stimulus response view, we really unpack that, and we actually articulate it a lot more in that paper that is forthcoming. It's just later this year. We've done the galley proofs just recently. If anyone's interested, you'll see a citation for it later. I'll gladly send it to you. But you're seeing this transition from the early SR stimulus response view, where it's dominated, to this construct view. Again, you'll see overlapping time periods. It's not as if one thing disappears and then another emerges. Then the period post Crombeck and Miel, mostly the 1960s to the end of the 1990s, again, broad pictures, saw the construct model take root and saw the measurement community delve into sort of the moral foundation of validity and testing by expanding to include the consequences of test use and interpretation. And the major protagonist and developer of these ideas was Sam Messick in a series of papers, but from at least 1975 to 1988. And his last published article was in an edited volume that I had. In fact, the whole volume is dedicated to Messick and his view. And I really find Messick's ideas very interesting and have built on them and worked them through. I'm one of the folks in the business, and there's a small group of us still. At one time we were a larger number, but who are really quite fascinated with what Messick was suggesting in his view of validity, validation, and bringing notions like consequences into the use of tests and to interpretation. Since that period, since 2000 to date, has actually been a real wide reawakening in which the debate about validity and validation has started up again after a quiet post-Cronbach-Camille period. So I'm going to try and articulate these a bit more and give you some more examples. So the early 1900s to the 1930s, more or less. And by this, I mean, it's not that this view stopped. I'm just saying this was its heyday. This is where it emerged and was the way that we were really thinking about this view of validity. The key idea from here is that validity can now be quantified. So validity is not the correlation. Validity, the phenomena of validity, the concept of validity, can be quantified through a correlation or association between a test score and a criterion. And wow, that's a mouthful of stuff, but really exciting. An objective measure, and so really then a measure becomes an objective measure of that which the test is used to measure, a criterion, or anything that correlates to it. 1930s to the 1960s, a proliferation of the many types of validity, and what we are validating, and that we're validating the measures themselves in the psychological literature and in the early versions of the American APA area and test standards. 1960s to 1990s, the types of validity talk is still dominant. You'll hear things like discriminant validity, convergent validity, this thing called face validity, etc., as well as and everyone had their own new thing that they could do to introduce one. My favorite one was someone who described once to me what they called a crosswalk panel stratified view type of validity. I'm like, crosswalk panels. Okay, everyone invented their own validity, and there's a massive proliferation of them, and it's simply extending much further this notion of the validity coefficient, right? And and you see things like multi-trait, multi-method matrices, etc. in this time period. So constructs take root in construct validity as the accumulation of evidence was really its dominance during the 1960s to the end of the 1990s, but peaked in the mid-1970s, and of course is still ongoing. Landmark paper, Cronbach-Camille, and the description of what they call construct validity and the explicit use of what they call the nomological network to establish the meaningfulness of a measure. Nomological, law-like network of relation among constructs, and that network of laws, and this was a time in psychology in that form of sort of the emergence of the earliest post behavioral, purely behavioral views, was beginning to introduce these nomological networks, these law-like behaviors. And I mean it literally like physical laws. And the aim here was this construct validity kind of idea. There's a paper that my colleague Brian Haig, I'm going to make reference to it a bit later. He actually takes a very nice critical view of this, and it's literally brand new. I think it was posted in November online. It's available. I'll show you the link in a bit later. But this view is still dominant today and it's still being criticized today. There are actually also some very good things that come out of this view. Constructability was based on an accumulation of research results, and that's actually kind of what I really like about it. Cronbach went on in 1971, and a later view of validity and perhaps a validation of validity as evaluation. So he began to explore the notion of the connection between validity theory and evaluation as in program evaluation, in some sense, a process of social rhetorical arguments that were being made in that context there. All right, so one, as I said earlier, one needs to articulate what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. If not, then validity becomes a technique. So validity is factor analysis, validity is a correlation coefficient, a validity is think aloud protocol. No, those are validation. You need to have an understanding of what we mean by validity so that you can select the appropriate method and also judge if you've progressed towards establishing your definition of validity. So what do I mean by definition or concepts? Well, I'm going to give you 8 of them that have emerged out of these 4 periods. There's others, other people could reorganize it. And some of these imply a particular process of validation. So the first one is that you saw early on that a test is a predictive device or a shorthand. That was very much in the criterion model. Therefore, validity is about establishing whether a test is a good predictive device or shorthand. Actually, that's a very nice, tidy definition. If a test is a predictive device, and I have a criterion model, so a test is a predictive device of something in the future or a efficient shorthand, getting to something that's more complex going on in the moment, well, then validity is about establishing whether the test is a good predictive device or shorthand. It's very nice. In that case, the correlation coefficient, right, determines the validity. That's Hull, yes, in the history of psychology and learning theory. That was Hull, 1928. Bingham, 1937. Validity is the correlation of test scores with some objective measure of that which the test is used to measure. So we have a primary validity evidence as criterion, correlation, and prediction. Second, so that was our first one, right? The second one is Garrett, 1937. And again, there's citations I can give you in the work. Garrett's statement that validity is the extent to which the test measures what it purports to measure. Well, that's not it's an interesting definition. In some ways carries a great deal of explanatory, a great deal of in a very concise sort of way of capturing it, but it doesn't tell us anything about how does one go about trying to validate. So in my opinion, Garrett, it was interesting. The reason I highlighted is that it's a general statement is particularly useful, but it's to say that validity is the extent to which a test measures what it purports to measure has limited has limited strength compared to, for example, this criterion model here, this predictive device, right? Which is more specific in that way. The third one is Cronbach and Milan, 1955, embodying the dominant, emergent and dominant view of philosophy of science, view of science as a logical empiricist. And they talk about the nomenological network and construct validity and inference. And Cronbach and Milan were influenced by philosophers at the time, and particularly Paul Milan was engaging with at the University of Minnesota. Milan's an important, not just psychologist, clinical psychologist, he's like an uber psychologist in all these areas. But Milan was also actively engaged in the philosophy of science, and particularly with the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Minnesota. So he's influenced by the particular philosophers of science at the time that began to really talk about a nomenological network. And in some of my publications that you'll see I cite, I began to show that how Mill is in fact influenced by. I'm not alone, others have done this. So it's this logical empiricist notion of a nomological network and construct validity, important because it signaled that tests changed from being predictive devices to being signs of an underlying attribute. So in the first conception of validity, a test is a predictive device. In the second, it's unstated. It's just something that, right, you're purporting to measure something else. And validity is, in a sense, how well the extent to which the test measures what it purports to measure. Now we say, okay, in 55, we now, in that area of psychology, we begin to accept again, sort of a post Freudian, post into sort of a beginnings of a neo-behaviorism, and we begin to move to underlying attributes. And so the test now becomes, or measures, a signal of something that is an underlying attribute. The validation now is to empirically establish that nomological network. Masick, I consider, is the fourth one, introduces a concept of validity, and it's reflected in the 1999 test standards. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores entailed by proposed uses. So now we see a shift here to the degree, to this notion of interpretation of test scores, so that you're not, as Masick would say, validating a test or a measure, but you're validating the inferences or claims that you're making from that measure. So now you see the Masick moving in there. So validation is the interpretation, right? So it is the interpretation of test scores required by proposed uses that are evaluated, not the test itself. Process of evaluation involves accumulating evidence, provide a sound scientific basis for proposed score interpretation. There's a lot of appeal in this idea. I think it's a very interesting idea. And there are multiple sources of validity evidence, and there's also consideration of consequences of test use. I think it's important to highlight the work of Professor Susan Embertson. Susan's done some outstanding work. There's a couple of citations, and is still active today in this. Embertson's work on construct representation versus nomothetic span, and a universal system of construct validity to illustrate how diverse evidence is relevant to measuring claims. This is particularly well suited for formal cognitive modeling. It's suited for other things, but really now we're beginning to introduce this sort of cognitive decomposition of tasks, and digging in between that stimulus and response, stimulus being the item and the response that's produced from there. The next one is the work of Boersboom, Mellenberg, and Van Heerden in 2004 in Psychological Review, who argue that a test is valid for measuring an attribute if and only if the attribute exists some way, and variations in the attribute causally produce variations in the outcomes of the measurement procedure. Outstanding. It's nicely articulated, gives us a lot to hang on to, and it's well suited, among other things, for formal cognitive modeling. But it's also, in this case, you now begin to take seriously the structure equation modeling or factor analysis, where you think of a latent variable, this oval in the path analysis, causing the item responses. So you see this oval and these arrows away from the oval to the items and scores or manifest variables. And it's really a very nice view. I actually share a lot in common with some of the ideas that Boersboom and his colleagues to this day are still articulating. There's variations that I highlight that I think are a little different, but we're not that far apart. The seventh one is validity is content representation. Evidence of content validity has been around for decades. I list listed Samuelson here because they really said validity is content representation, meaning you have a domain that you've mapped out, particularly useful for educational tests. So let's say you're developing a test for admission to your psychology department or to your education or into graduate school. And then if you have a mapped out domain, and then validity is whether your items correspond to that domain. And then my own work, and I've taken validity as I bring in the notion of explanation focused view. I've recently learned that actually Brian Haig and actually began to move in this direction and articulating this as well. A few years before I did, I think it was in the late 1990s. I think I did my first version of it about 2002, 2003. But I think it's important to recognize that Brian Haig has been moving in that direction. And in his forthcoming paper that I cite later, he was actually really playing this out a bit more, and he actually builds on that idea. But I do want to recognize that Haig has done some important work right at the beginning on bringing forward explanation and the role of explanation. Causal explanation is only from if one reads the particular view of philosophy of science. Causation and causal models are only one form of explanation, and this is what I share with, and we share with people like Denny Boersboom and colleagues, is that. But here I'm taking a larger view, and particularly myself taking a larger view of what is explanation. And a little bit later, we'll see that in some of my slides. If we don't get to it, it'll be there for you to read a bit later. You'll also see that I violate the fundamental rule that some people believe is a rule with little to no empirical evidence, that you're not supposed to have a lot of words on your slides. Well, sure, if that might be the case in some settings, but I'm talking about across languages, cultures, and I'm also using this as a guide for the descriptions. So you'll see lots of words and citations. I raised by my lovely late Italian mama, and any good Italian boy loves his mama. I'll ask for forgiveness later, as my mama would say, but I'm going to continue putting lots of words on my slides, whatever the pop theorists believe is the rule of putting together slides. There's lots of words. You'll have lots to read if we don't get to it. I focus on a contextualized pragmatic view of explanation. That was a little digression, my apologies. So I'm not only dealing with explanation, but I have a particular view that I talk about, contextualized and pragmatic, particularly well suited as a foundation for cognitive and statistical modeling of item responses and test score data. And for also what my adaptation of the Draper-Lindley Diffinetti method that comes out looking at the bounds on the inferences. Yes, that's my other connection to Milan, is Bruno Diffinetti and his subjectivist view of probability, of which I'm trained originally as a mathematician. I still find a lot of appeal to. So cognitive statistical modeling, my DLD, Draper-Lindley Diffinetti, and also focusing on studies of heterogeneity leading to this idea of the many ways of being human. So we can move, this cognitive integration in 2007. In the Handbook of Statistics, I talked about a sort of a judicial courtroom metaphor, the weighing of evidence. Barry Forer and Barry's now a former PhD student and who's finished, had a good career, is continuing to have a good career. We looked at multi-level constructs. So if you're doing, for example, in national surveys, you might have, or if you're doing in educational settings, you might actually have a multi-level sort of approach. So you're not making claims about individuals, but about regions. For example, in a study, we say the quality of life in regions of Italy. Well, I don't know how to tell you this. You're not but the data comes from responses from individuals in those regions. We've articulated a multi-level view of doing construct validation that emerges out of this as well. And the most recent work that I've been working on for the last, I'd say about 10 years plus, has been this response processes. And they're important in this explanation-focused view, a series of papers. And here I'm doing work with my colleague, Dr. Nita Hubley. Professor Hubley is a colleague of mine here at UBC. And we've been actually working together for over 30 years before I came to UBC. But most recently, my work with Brian Maddox has been unpacking this. And Brian himself has also been looking at response processes. And we've also been doing work together, and I'm doing work on my own. But there's a paper in the European Journal of Psychological Assessment that's forthcoming by Brian, by Zumbo, Maddox, and Kerr. So there, where we talk about process constructs as well as person constructs. All right. So you've seen a history. You've seen for big periods, they actually reflect the history of psychology and the history of the social sciences. And then you've seen sort of different views of what is validity, 8 of them, 7 of which actually articulate some way of formulating the validation practices. So now I want to move towards very quickly, because I know there were about 50 minutes into my presentation, and I don't want to overstep my lovely invitation with you all. But you'll see me now moving very quickly through to the idea of construct theories and the explanation-centered view of validity and validation. All right, so let's take a deep dive into construct theories. This is, I think, very important. And if we don't get to some of the things at the end, I grow tired, you grow tired, we can stop and you can continue reading on your own another time. And I'd be happy to engage with you. So let's take a deep dive into construct theories. I want to describe the encounter of a person and an item or task. That's the fundamental idea that I want to drive in here. That all of, if in fact a measure or a test has some task or item which elicits or compels you to respond in some way, and then that is scored, multiple items. So this actually can be applied to one item, but let's for the moment stay with the multiple item and an overall score, that CSD. But the building block is the item. The item is a manifestation of an encounter, or some people would call it interaction, of a person and an item. This idea of the interaction of a person and item is fundamental to a lot of interesting psychometric theory. Perhaps the most prominent is item response theory or rationalysis, which actually focuses on a stochastic or probabilistic model of the item response. And it postulates through characteristics of the items, discrimination, difficulty, right? Lower asymptote, maybe even upper asymptote, depending on the kind of item you have, the kind of IRT you're doing. And it's those item properties come together with a person's level of their ability, the attribute, the score. And so IRT really builds on this encounter mathematically and statistically. But so does classical theory. And there's, I'm originally trained as a mathematician. It's been over 30 years now. I think this year's 32 years that I've been a tenure track professor. And 1990, 1989 began at the University of Ottawa as a tenure track professor. I came out of, originally out of pure mathematics, applied mathematics into really mathematical sciences, and in my case, the mathematical social sciences. And in that, I also have articulated work with my mentor, the late Don Zimmerman, where we did a measure theoretic view of validity. And in that measure theory being a type of mathematics, area of mathematics, using measure theory, it's actually not an area of math that's used a lot in psychometrics. And so when we publish using it, like recently, my colleague Ed Kroc and I, Dr. Kroc and I, published a paper in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology articulating how x equals t plus e actually has various versions of it in various disciplines and how they're interconnected, and also generalizing it even further. But that, building on that area, is about the encounter of an item and a person. In fact, the true score of classical test theory, the universe score of generalizability theory, or a latent variable score, a predicted score on a latent variable in IRT or in factor models, latent variable models, all of those really capture this interaction. And so, but I want to focus, really zoom in on that. That is, I think, something important. All right. So I talk about putting the psychology back in psychometrics. I'm not the only person who's doing this. In fact, I would argue that particularly Professor Ambertson, Susan Ambertson, has done, in one way, is one of the people that's really been pushing to put psychology back in psychometrics. But so did Lee Cronbach back in the 1950s, talking about this idea that psychometrics assessment has become overly drawn by statistics. Now, I have to highlight for you the irony of me saying this. The person who, if you want to think about taking us far away from the psychology in some ways, is a measure theoretic view of psychometrics and measurement. Yes, but I never forget. So yes, of the abstruse, obtuse, arcane mathematical scientists working in psychometrics, I may be the most abstruse, arcane, long-winded of them all, at least right now. And those are not all positive features, but since we're doing public confessional, here I am. But at the same time, I don't forget that we're trying to put the psychology back into this. So I'm, in a way, in this almost split personality, I'm going in two directions like this. Main message is what we should be talking about in describing the encounter of a person and an item or a task, or what people call the interaction. But I prefer the term encounter, and I've been writing about this for quite a while, and you'll see me even talking about into the early 2000s, where this has been the encounter, that interaction. So I'm drawing that forward. IRT does it, classical test theory, etc. But I want to bring it forward. Today, I'm going to continue to focus on statistical ideas and reasoning, but mixed methods are continuing to grow in the work of my friend Jose Luis Padilla and his colleagues, including Benitez and others. I've really been pushing this idea and developing it a great deal. I think it's lovely work. A couple of citations of what they would call mixed methods. As much as possible, however, we're going to rely on research methods and data tools motivating psychological interpretation and theorizing. They come in various forms and lengths, and knowledge, psychological. Despite these various, all assessments share the property of being composed of a series of items, tasks, or questions. Simply stated again, to remind us again, items are the building block. And item analysis now is not just about item total correlations or IRT parameters or Roche model parameters, but also getting a lens into, as Andre Rupp and I would say, these are lenses into the cognitive and ecology of item responding. So individuals' responses, just to remind us, play double duty. They're used both to give someone a score on an attribute, but also they're used about studying the measures themselves. So what makes this particularly thorny is that individuals are used for both inferences about the quality of the items and about the level of the respondents. It should be noted that many authors refer to construct validity as the most important characteristic of a test, but fascinating enough, it's seldom defined. And this never became more evident to me than at the University of Maryland conference on validity, where, at the dinner before, there was there I was sitting there, Denny Borsboom, there was Susan Embretson, Michael Kane. We've all been invited to give main addresses, and that book, a chapter of mine appeared in that book that emerged from that conference. Bob Mislevy was there as well, doing important work. It struck me there. Denny Borsboom was there, and others. It became very apparent to me. And we all use the word construct, but I don't think everyone had defined it well enough. And I don't think we were talking about the same thing. Well, actually, a clear statement of what a construct is and the logic of construct validation was in Cronbach and Milan in 1955. So Cronbach and Milan wrote that, and now one can say that was then and this is now, so perhaps Embretson may have a different articulated view of this, but the reality is Cronbach and Milan did a very good job of it, and I think most interpretations of construct validities don't deviate too far from Cronbach and Milan. So they wrote that a construct is some postulated attribute of people assumed to be reflected in test performance. This comes out of the tradition of individual differences. People vary in their test performance, and the question is, why do people vary? Well, a construct is some postulated attribute of people assumed to be reflected in test performance. Test validation, the attribute about which we make statements in interpreting a test, is a construct. So a construct in this sense is the attribute. We expect a person at any time, this is that, they continue saying, to possess or not possess a qualitative attribute. Yes, there can be qualitative attributes, unbeknownst to some of the critics. Nothing says that there isn't. You can do, today we'd call these latent classes and latent class response theory, of which they exist, or possess some degree of a quantitative attribute. So typical classical test theory or typical item response theory or factor analysis, or some merging of the two, both an attribute and a qualitative and a quantitative attribute. In the paper by Ed Klock and I recently in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology, the lens that we bring on to from measure theory, one of the advantages of it is that an attribute can be both qualitative and quantitative. It's not just discrete versus continuous. If you really look at the fundamental mathematics, we would argue, and lay this out using an area of mathematical analysis called measure theory, one of the benefits of that is that a variable, which is sort of a measure on a space and defined in that way, can actually have both features to it. But nonetheless, as Cronbach and Milan said, we can expect a person at any time to possess or not possess a qualitative attribute or possess some degree of a quantitative attribute. Persons who possess this attribute will, in situation X, act in manner Y with a certain probability. There you go. The logic of construct validation, and this is all one paragraph, I've broken it up. The logic construct validation is invoked whether the construct is highly systematized or loose, used in ramified theory or in a few simple propositions, used in absolute propositions or in probability statements. The logic applies it to all of those. Construct validity does not only work with highly systematized or ramified theory. In fact, instead, it applies to any of these. They go on and they say, we seek to specify how one is to defend proposed interpretation of a test. Page 247, those are actually all one pair sentences back to back on page 247 of Cronbach and Milan. It tells an attribute of person reflected in test performance. Hey, maybe in a way, my friend Denny Borsboom and his colleagues share more in common with Cronbach and Milan than some of us would think. I know they know this, and they also know how they're different from that. But this is so it's about an attribute. The attribute is about The attribute which we make statements, interpreting a test is the construct. Well, note that in the development or revision of our research efforts are directed towards providing an evidential basis, empirical support for making at least two kinds of inferences. So if we see in the far left, we have the items of the CSD. The observed score is often the sum or average of those item responses. Total scores are also called the observed scores, composite score, etc. You now see sort of in a way what is going on in terms of these kinds of claims or inferences that we want to make. We go from the observed score to the target value of the observed test score, right? And it's called the true score or universe score in generalizability theory, or latent variable score, the theta of IRT. In all cases, the item responses are manifestations of an unobserved variable in common among the items, a factor of factor analysis, or a random effect, if you want to write it as a random effects or mixed effects model. Then in the third part of it, we have the construct or attribute. So we go from the observed score to some score. We often make claims about some unobserved score, if you wish, true score of test theory, universe score, or theta of IRT, latent variable. And then to the construct, where the construct is meaningfully related to other constructs to form a theory of what we intend to measure and can then be verified empirically. So the direction of the arrow is meant to suggest the direction when we are validating the inferences or claims. That first arrow from observed score to some, and the idea here is that it's either what Rod McDonald would call an item sampling model and others. But the idea is that these items are not all the possible items. Now you could do that, but then test theory becomes descriptive, which is fine. But typically when we do it, we say these items are a sampling, many possible items that could be given, or they are a subset. Doesn't have to be right of those items, and that you go from those items to the score on the whole. So it's, and this first phase is the data quality. That's what, right? Data quality, and then you go from that underlying score to an inferential quality. So as a product of the statistical byproduct of the statistical models of psychometric theory, there is no such thing as a predicted score on a construct. You can get a predicted score on so you can go from the observed score, you can get a predicted true score, you can get a predicted, a little harder to do, predicted universe score, but you can certainly get a predicted latent variable score. I know we use the word, we estimate theta, but actually it's a prediction from the items. Even statistically, it's a prediction. So you're predicting some true score. That's what we do in a sense when we talk about test reliability of any kind, internal consistency, test retest, whether you're a fan of alpha, omega, beta, gamma, or any of the other ones that you're interested in. The first one's about data quality, and the second is inferential quality. So we can imagine two parts or stages. Data quality predicted. The first arrow is from observed variables to latent or unobserved variables. The true scores of classical test theory being one of them. And the second arrow is the inferential quality depicted by the arrow on the far right. It's for the inference from the latent variable to claims about the construct. The first one, you can actually get a predicted score. You do not get, in this notion, there is no such thing as a score on a construct. And this also highlights that the observed score is not the construct. Likewise, the predicted true score, or theta, is also not the construct. We need to stop saying this. It's not the case. So validity, if we follow this arrow, you can see that what we actually have in validity is that we use test scores, right? Is that when we use test scores, in essence, we're traveling from the observed score to claims about the test taker in terms of the intended attribute or construct. The first phase is measurement error reliability. The second phase is validity, but really validity, if you wish, is the whole thing. It should be clear at this point that the data quality, reliability, has an effect on validity. An unreliable assessment will have limited validity. That's true mathematically if you define validity as that criterion correlation in classical test theory, but it's also true conceptually. And so those few papers that did years ago to say that, reliability does not impact validity, I challenge you to really try and see how that could be the case. Because constructs are not the same as the observed or as the unobserved true, universal, or latent variable, we can have the case of construct under representation or construct irrelevant variance. So construct under representation occurs when a test does not adequately measure all aspects. So you're narrowing the construct. And you can get construct irrelevant variance as a source of invalidity, so it's construct under representation. And the guiding question for construct irrelevant variance is, to what extent are we measuring an attribute, some other attribute with a test? I'll let you spend some more time on this yourself, but a construct under representation can impact a great deal. I mean, you're narrowing the construct, right? The construct under representation is found to contribute to consequences. When it is, then the construct needs to be revised or adapted. For example, in cross-cultural comparisons, it is crucial to ask whether a new cultural group conceives or values the construct in the same manner as the original test development group. This is important, for example, in the area of well-being and quality of life, or measures of time use. I mean, how is this valued? Does the construct travel from language and culture? And the answer to this question reveals how much the obtained scores reflect construct under representation or construct irrelevancy as sources of invalidity. I'll let you spend some time about construct irrelevant messages. To what extent are we measuring our attribute of interest or some other attribute? And I say by observing the test situation, we hope to identify clues about the way that it's being understood and performed as a social occasion. So the encounter of a task, a person with a task, is really, from a social theory point of view, is a social occasion. It's a performative act. And it brings the psychology back into psychometrics. Right? Central question in construct irrelevant variance as a source of invalidity. What extent might be measuring unintentionally other unimportant constructs, such as conformity to expected cultural norms related to, for example, multiculturalism, ethnicity, gender identity, gender roles, sexual identity, sexual roles. The gender bias of this crying item of item 17 really came up, where that item was, have you had a crying spell if you cried in the last week? Well, actually, there's a tremendous gender bias on the response to that item. That and you can see the paper, this paper here actually is cited in the revision of the CSD. That item has been dropped in the CSDR. And it's an interesting item. It's kind of unfortunate that it's been dropped. I wish there was another way of dealing with this differential item function and item bias in this case, where in fact what was happening is that the threshold for endorsing the item is lower on the overall score for respondents who identified as female rather than respondents who identified as male. So if you think about it on the same level of depressive symptomatology, respondents who identify as female tended to give a higher score on the item than individuals who identified as male. Well, that's problematic because, and it may be associated with higher levels of classification of individuals who identify as female as being depressed. And it could be because of the item bias in this context. alternative explanation. My colleague, Dr. Nita Hubley, years ago gave me an alternative explanation, which was, well, maybe men are underrepresenting it in the sense that it takes a higher threshold for men to say they've responded. This kind of thing needs more mixed methods work. It needs the kind of work that my friend Brian Maddox does, bringing together anthropology and culture and going into it in microprocesses. But a lot more work needs to go into this, and this is where the explanatory element comes in. I'm going to say a few words about argument-based validity because I don't think it would be fair to anyone if I didn't. And then we're going to stop, and you can read all the other slides on your own as we later, or in fact, we can have a conversation another time. Growing out of the idea that valid inferences that we're validating inferences and uses, this notion of an argument came about. So validity as so arguments of, as in by this I mean logical arguments, an argument of, so validity becomes an argument-based approach. So in this idea that we must clearly state that the inference, the assumptions that move us from observed performances to proposed interpretations regarding. Michael Kane has done the most work in this area, and I give some citations of his work on an interpretive argument, which clearly states the assumptions and inferences that we need to move from. It actually was first proposed, and Michael, of course, in 1992 in Psychological Bulletin, acknowledges, of course, that it's been he's far elaborated and extended Kane's Cronbach's initial statements about arguments and the use of arguments. Lee Cronbach, Michael Kane, Laurie Shepard, and others. The Shepard 19, Laurie, she did a remarkable job. If you can get your hands, I have a citation for that. Read that paper. It's, my opinion, it's probably as important as the Cronbach and Milan papers. And others have advocated for using argument to frame or focus validation efforts and to clarify interpretations. And this provides us guidance on allocating our research effort, engaging progress. I think there's important work that's being done on this. Here's Michael. He sort of says, there's observed performance. So the responding, then you get an observed score. And therefore that's the scoring phase. Then you go from the observed score to he's a generalizability theory scholar to the universe score, or you could say that's a theta of a late of IRT, or a true score of classical test theory. And then, so that's a generalization, and then the other is an extrapolation. So you see that he has a different picture than what I had earlier. But the general idea still is the same kind of idea there. And he then says, well, you can either do a construct label, a trait interpretation, or you can use it for things like certification, admission, testing, etc. That's a decision or an implication. Different forms, he talked about different forms of interpretive arguments. Interpretive argument followed by the validity argument, and descriptive versus decision-making purposes. We can articulate it really as we begin with an observed score, an observation, then you get an observed, so a response, then you get an observed score, but there I called it total score earlier. Then the universe score, classical test theory, true score, or theta of IRT or factor analysis, the interpretation skill level, and then the decision or use. You can see there's a big influence in this idea from generalizability theory, not too surprising. Kane is a prominent advocate with people like Rob Bennett, reminding us of the importance, use of generalizability theory, so don't be too surprised that. I believe there's a connection to the Draper-Lindley-DeFinetti framework that I introduced first in 2007. And Kane was interesting because he began to talk about a competency versus a construct. And so competencies are more behavioral ideas. So the nice thing about Kane's work is he begins to cleave this idea, it's been around by others, before, but he does a nice job cleaning this idea of a competency versus a construct. So a construct is an attribute. Competency is actually something more defined behaviorally or within a network of possible outcomes. The work of Lyle Bachman I particularly like, and the one that I'm citing here is his 2005 paper, and he differentiates between arguments that lead toward description versus those that lead to a particular decision. He feels that there's not enough systematic attention focused on the decision. And he proposes another framework, same kind of ideas, you'll see it there, scoring, generalization, extrapolation. That is the interpretive argument. Then we have a decision, same kind of idea, and that is the utilization argument. And utilization has relevance, utility, intended consequences, and sufficiency. So I really like what Bachman's done. And these are the warrants, if you wish, for the claims of the utilization of the argument. Before we call it a day and begin at least a little time for discussion, I want to share with you a synthesis that I've done, or a more explicit synthesis of construct theories and argument-based approaches. So I'm going to start with this approach to validity and validation described by Anita Hubely and I. So after considering the argument-based approaches, we can now turn and consider how they fit with the construct theory approaches. Argument approaches have embraced certain construct theories, but they foreground competencies. They foreground this argument. Let us consider where different forms of evidence might be used to support this interpretive argument. It ends with an interpretation, and I've added the utilization aspects of Lyle Bachman. So in 2011, the Journal Social Indicators Research, the journal, the journal that's devoted to the measurement and quality of life, actually edited in Italy. The editor-in-chief is Professoressa Filomena Maggino, who's at La Sapienza, but it's still going. It's actually formed and edited for decades by Professor Alex Michaelis. You'll see a lot of work by Alex and I. In that journal, Anita Hubely and I introduced this sort of very elaborated view of thinking about construct theory and validation. You'll see values are there throughout. We highlight the importance of values in theorizing. You see, we start with a construct, get a test and measure, then we focus on score, meaning, and inference, because we think that's essential to with any kind of use. And then you see that different kinds of evidence, like convergent discriminant, criterion-related, content-related, bringing it to score, meaning, score structure, reliability, et cetera, generalizability theory, variance. Then we have the intended and social and personal consequences, because there are intended social and personal ones, and unintended social and personal consequences. And those are important distinctions that we need to make. Well, I rearranged these, and then I laid on top of it this argument-based approach. So I took now this is an explicit synthesis of construct theories. As I said, with our argument-based approaches have always, there's no reason to, I mean, in Michael Kane's work, their constructs are there, but I'm going to foreground these and try and do an explicit synthesis. So now you see that scoring and generalization, extrapolation, utilization. Now I want to highlight that intended social and personal consequences are related. Those arrows go both ways with utilization as well as the unintended ones. A little bit of work from logic in philosophy, actual formal logic, study of formal logic. At some conceptual level, we might compare the argument-based approach and explanation face to pose by posing the following question. Is an explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? There's multiple answers to this, but turning to logic, explanations are seen as types of arguments. There are at least two types of arguments, justificatory and explanatory types of arguments.
So is an argument, is an explanation an argument, or an argument an explanation? Multiple answers, of course, depending how you frame this. But if we turn to logic, explanations are seen as types of arguments, right? And so there are these two types of arguments, justificatory and explanatory. And distinguished largely by purpose rather than use. The explanatory argument provides an explanation of why or how something we agree about has happened, and how did we arrive at a particular interpretation. The justificatory argument provides reasons for that belief, and why should I accept the proposed interpretation. And so this is the way I'm beginning to frame it. Focusing on the purpose of the argument brings our attention to who the audience is, which may be important. The interpretive argument is more explanatory, I think, and the validity argument is more justificatory. And I think that matches well with Michael Kane. We move from chains of inferences, we're combining explanation. Interesting parallel here on the use of a test to guide validation work. And I think it's important to highlight here that although it's clear from the validity argument that it serves to evaluate the pieces of the interpretive argument, what standards ought to be used, whether the interpretive argument context is complete or serves its purpose. And that really Messick, 1995, the American psychologist. Perhaps by conceptualizing the interpretive argument as explanatory, we gain a new set of criteria for explanations by which to evaluate our interpretive argument. I'm not going to say too much. We're leveraging explanatory frameworks, coherence, plausibility. Of course, just like measures are fallible, arguments are fallible. And so we need analogous sort of ideas on how to look at the approach that I am particularly keen on, which is inference to the best explanation, IBE, abductive approaches, and I've been writing about that since the early 2000s. 2007, I've done it, but also earlier. In sum, a hypothesis provides the best explanation when it is more explanatory, powerful, also viable, modest, simple, conservative, and any competing hypotheses. I'm going to stop here because I think I've used a lot of time, and there's a couple more sections, but I'll leave that for another there for you. And you can actually begin to see how the many ways of being human now emerges. And I think that is an important part. I want to mention here Brian Haig, this important paper on repositioning construct validity. It's actually on the archive online, but the paper is also being considered for publication right now. And I lean towards abductive and really inference the best explanation kind of views. And Haig's done important ideas. And so it's about the process of validation. There's strong and weak theories, but where I really want to begin, Cronbach and Meal, I bring a more pragmatic view, and this is that Maryland conference. And so for me, validity is the explanation, and validation is how we go about to establish, support, test, confirm that explanation. And in here is a key idea in terms of the many ways of being human, comes into all of this because in my pragmatic explanation-focused view, I emphasize heterogeneity, I emphasize cultural elements, I look at this. I do not, as many people in psychometrics do, go into sort of a moral panic over gender identity, gender expression, sexual identity, cultural expression. Those are baked into the views that I'm building. All right, and this important paper by Addy, Maddox, and I actually bring in a Latourian, a Bruno Latour, and this notion of the public discourse on how we narrow our notions of validity. I strongly recommend this.